Thank you for coming to episode 29 of Silver Lining for Learning. We started this many months ago. We never thought it would go this far, but we've gone this far. We've talked to a lot of people about the silver lining during this crisis. We've visited many places, and we always enjoy having conversations with the students. I think last time when we had students on this show, that was one of the highlights. So today, again, we are bringing students. We have Tex Mickelson from Australia. I don't know how many of you have been to Australia. This is from not a very big place. I'm very happy that you're recommended by your principal to come here. We have Kanua from Mid-Pacific School in Hawaii. Thanks, Kanua, for joining us. We have Emmy. I don't know, actually, I can't remember where Emmy is from. And Emmy, you will show us very soon. And then we have today Christidi and Punya Mishra and Yong Zhao will be the co-host. So let me actually start by asking you, or our guest, but I will start with Tex. Tell us about your school and why do you think there is innovative? What are you doing in your school and what's the school doing, what you're doing? Tex?
In our school, some of the innovation would definitely be with our teachers in our class. They understand that some other classes need more help, so they can leave us and help each other out. And through our programs towards where in our STEM, you get to focus every different lesson. You get to focus on a new part of the whole curriculum. So they all tie in together, but the teachers are very good at letting students do their own thing in the class to an extent. They're still there, obviously, making sure you're working, but they're not monitoring you all the time, and it's leading the students to understand and do their work. And just the programs have been really useful in coming up through primary school to high school. They've started a LEAP program to really assist students who aren't as used to the whole high school moving around class as new teachers environment.
Well, thanks, Tex. I think you are in 7th grade yourself. And you're 12-year-old, right?
I'm 12, yeah. It's my birthday in 6 days.
Okay, congratulations. Happy birthday. So let me move to Kanua. Thank you. Can you share with us about what you are doing and what your school going on? And what I know your school has been doing something quite interesting at Mid-Pac.
Yeah, sure. So I can't really speak about the school relative to, any other school, but I did go to a different school in Asia prior to coming to Mid-Pac. So I'll sort of talk about how it differs from that school in particular. What I found was right when I got into high school, you couldn't just pick your classes. You could pick how your high school experience was going to work, right? So I went with MPX, which is our Mid-Pacific Exploratory, which is exclusively project-based, experiential, hands-on, that kind of thing, because that's what worked for me. And from there, I went into full IB, which I'm enjoying a ton. But I think that whole freedom of choice is something that I think Mid-Pac does quite well. And that's not to mention how much the teachers and faculty try to integrate technology into all the classes we're doing in a way that, sometimes you integrate tech in a way that doesn't really feel right. It feels like it's not really adding to the way you're learning. But I feel like at Mid-Pac, it actually is part of the production of knowledge and whatnot. So, yeah.
And you are in 12th grade?
Yes, I am in 12th grade.
Okay. So I don't know where you're going to college next, and if college is going to be open, we don't know. Okay, hang in there.
Yes.
Emmy?
Hi.
Hey, so tell us about your school experience or your own experience leading student voice.
Yeah, so the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team is an organization that was founded around 8 years ago out of the larger Pritchard Committee for Academic Excellence, which has been mobilizing citizens to improve Kentucky schools for over 30 years. And we came into play as the youth arm of the organization really to integrate students as partners and as primary stakeholders, as co-creators of their education. And so I work as our student director alongside a team of many other students working really for education justice and changing the way our school system works. And we do that in many ways. Particularly, we're focused on research, policy, and advocacy.
Well, tell us more about the co-creating process. I'm just curious about how do you get to co-create the curriculum?
Yeah, so we think of student voice on a spectrum, and we know that there are different levels of student voice. And it's not to say that some are better than others, but we know that some are more meaningful and others are less meaningful. And so we know that there's expression. Oftentimes, this is the most common form of student voice, where students are operating within adults' agenda, but they are present. They might be protesting, like holding up signs. But when we get to a level like consultation or partnership, students might be included in a focus group, or they might take a survey. Again, they're still operating within an agenda that they did not co-design. But when we get to the higher levels of activism and leadership, students are really creating equally with adults what their experience looks like. And so one way that I like to conceptualize this in our work is that we're thinking about an activism that moves from protest to policymaking, and where students are really partners with legislators, with stakeholders, with citizens. And so that is kind of how we think about engaging in this work.
Well, thank you. And let me actually correct myself. Do you go by Amy, right?
Yeah, Amy or Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you so much. And you are in 12th grade as well?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Puneet, you have a question?
Sorry, I had a broader question to all three of you, which is, schools have been out since March. So what's sort of the status of schools right now in your specific regions? And more than that, really, how did your schools, or what did you guys do once schools sort of went online, or what was it, whatever it happened in your particular context? And maybe we'll take it in a different order this time. Start with you, Kanoa. And there was a question in the chat which you might want to address as well about the transition from this to the IB program in that space as well. And then after that, I think go to Emmanuel and then to Tex.
Thank you. So our school went virtual spring break last year, and we have been remote since then. Our elementary has gone back. That includes kindergarten, but middle school and high school as of now are still completely remote. Other schools on the island, one or two of them have actually gone back, but in a very limited capacity. And we do have plans to come back to school, but there will be a lot of changes, and I can't really speak to how it's going to be when we do go back. As for the transition from project-based learning to IB, I was a little bit concerned. I felt like MPX was a very different program to IB, but when I sort of came into IB my sophomore year, it wasn't as jarring as I expected. I think because a lot of the work I was doing, sure, it was more rigorous and it was in different subjects, but it was still, a lot of it was still project-based. None of it was hands-on anymore. None of it was, actually working with my hands or doing various engineering projects. It was project-based with other people, but in a different context. So I thought the transition was fine, but that's just me. I can't speak for anyone else.
Thank you. Emmy?
Our state is in a lot of different formats. I think that each places has had to respond differently. For example, I live in Lexington, which is more urban, whereas a lot of rural schools have gone back in person. Our school is completely virtual, and we will remain virtual as long as the University of Kentucky is open, because there have been a lot of cases due to students and faculty being in person. I think the student voice team engaged in a study this summer. We led a project called the Coping with COVID-19 study, and through that we surveyed almost 13,000 students from all 120 counties, and there are definitely differing opinions from students as well about what they felt comfortable with in terms of returning to school and what returning meant. And I think one of the threads we're seeing as we analyze that data and as we now engage in our second process of 50 peer-to-peer interviews is that students do want to be partners in creating what this transition looks like and want to be in the room as decisions are being made. And so one of the things that we're advocating for is that teachers really see students as partners, and we want to do our best to support that.
Just funny, sorry about that. I just want to follow up with Amy. How big is the organization? How many schools are involved?
So we're independent of schools, but we have about 100 students working with us at any given time from across the state, and about 30 to 40 who are active in this particular project.
It's called Student Voice. So are you going in national or international?
So the Pritchard Committee Student Voice team is just statewide in Kentucky, but we work with national partners. There's another organization called Student Voice. We're named similarly, but that does work nationally. And then we work with Student Voice and other partners as a part of the Education Justice Collective. This summer, we worked with Student Voice as a founding member organization to craft the Move School Forward guiding principles, which were 10 principles as we navigate the compounding crises of COVID-19 and systemic racism that student-led organizations across the country work together to craft.
All right, thank you. Sorry that I made a mistake because I was confusing you with another student I was in touch with. That's from Iowa. Sorry about that. Okay, so you're in Lexington, Kentucky, Amy. Thank you. Puna, go forward.
Tex, COVID, post-COVID, what happened in between? What have you been up to? Give us some sense of that.
Yeah, for our school, it's been a bit more different because we've been in halfway through term 2, we started going back to school 1 day a week. And then a few weeks later, we've fully moved on to full back to school. And for the past 2 terms now, we've been back to normal. So it's some activities like athletics carnivals or extracurricular activities have been cancelled. But for the most part, we've been able to reset quite well, and that's due to the teachers in our program, which is able to sustain some struggles and then get back to normal.
You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Puna, for that question. Chris, you go ahead.
Sure. So there's a lot of disagreement in society and among educators about what is a good school. And I'm going to show you sort of a continuum with 2 extremes at each end. At one end, there's something that has different names in different places. In Boston, we call it an exam school. And the goal of the school is to get people who have really high scores on the high stakes standardized tests, who have all A's, who get into elite colleges, and that's what constitutes a good school for people who believe in that. At the other end of the spectrum, you have schools, not as many, but a few, and I work with a few of those schools, who believe that when you graduate, they want you to have a love of learning. They want you to know what you're passionate about, what you want to do with your life, to the extent that's possible, depending on what age you are. They want you to know how to make a difference in the world. So this relates to what Emmy is talking about. And they want you to have some dispositions like flexible and tenacious and innovative that they believe are going to be important in the future. Now, of course, this is a dichotomy, not a dichotomy, but a continuum. There's lots of schools at different places in the middle. But often there are arguments among educators and among parents or policymakers about what kind of school is really a good school. And they're disagreeing on very fundamental things, as you can tell from my descriptions. So there's no right answer to this, but I'd like each of you to tell me where you think your school is on that continuum. And then if you could move your school, if you wanted to move your school, what direction you would move it in.
You want to start with any one person?
Whoever wants to dive into that. I understand it's a complicated question.
I can start. I think that my school falls much more to the exam end of the spectrum. And I think it's particularly frustrating for those of us that do crave the love of learning type of education. And I think one question that our team has been wrestling with, particularly in the midst of the pandemic, is that our definition of education or society's definition doesn't match up with how we conceptualize learning, and that learning is much more broad, that we're learning from cooking, from cleaning, from caretaking, from community organizing, that students are essential workers in this moment and not getting any credit for that work. And so what does it mean to think about learning and how that might better match up with how the system is defining education? And we want to kind of move the needle on that front, because we think it's a real equity issue at its core, to only think about traditional classroom learning as our education. We know that our education, particularly right now, but always, has never been limited to the confines of the school building or the Zoom session. And so we think really at its core, students have to lead the way in defining and redefining what our learning looks like.
And you've identified a point that I didn't make that I think is very important in that contrast, and that is how many students can be successful, because exam schools, like exams, grade on the curve. So a small proportion of students are at the top, and then everybody else is pushed down. And of course, if you come from a marginalized background, then you're more likely, regardless of talent, to end up farther down in the chain. And in contrast, schools that use not norm reference grading, which is grading on the curve, but criterion reference grading, where if you meet a certain threshold, everybody above the threshold gets the grade. You could have everybody graduating as valedictorian, conceivably, in a school like that. And what you're identifying is that if you're concerned about equity, it's a really tough road in exam schools, because they're set up to discriminate. It's baked into their DNA to discriminate. So Kanoa, tell me about where your school is on the continuum, or at least the part of your school that you interact with, and if you could move it, which direction would you move it?
Yeah, I think definitely. So like I said, there's different ways that at our school you can shape your curriculum how you want it, right? And I think the way I have it set up, because I find that I learn the best this way, it is definitely, I'm not going to call it the left, but the love of learning side, But I do know people who I am close with who are in equally rigorous courses and classes who have their schedule set up in a way where they're taking exams all the time because that's what they like. But yes, I don't want to force everyone to do what works for me. So I can't say that I wish my school was always like this, right? Because there are people who thrive under the sort of exam paper, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's how it is for me at least.
And you're also picking up on something important that wasn't part of the question, which is that instead of school being a uniform thing where you say one size fits all, whether it's one end of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum, ideally it's like an ecosystem, and there's different niches in the ecosystem, and you go to the niche that makes sense for you at that time. And then you don't have arguments about whether it's better to be a monkey or a tiger or a tree, because you're each, kind of in the place that you will want to be doing what you want to be doing. So that's an important dimension that you're adding. Tex, how about you?
I'd say our school's not super on the far left, but definitely further on that side. We've been doing a fair bit of work with some things to do with love of learning. And whilst we do have teachers and students that prefer and sometimes use the more exam type learning, as a whole, I'd say our school focuses on still getting the message across and still making sure that students learn, but trying to make sure that they don't wake up and not want to go to school.
Great. I'm good.
Well,
Another
I
question?
think Punya has a big question. Punya, go for it.
Sure. So I'm just really, Emmy, just listening to you was it's so wonderful because clearly you have found something that you're passionate about and you have found an avenue to pursue that within. So this is a question for all three of you. What are you sort of passionate and interested in learning about? A. B, how did it sort of get there? How do you think it sort of emerged? Why did that interest come about? So Emmy, in your case, why did this interest come about that you've talked so eloquently about? And then do you see school as having helped with that? Or is that something that you sort of have to do sort of on your own? And just to mix things up, I'll go with Kanoa first, Tex, and then Emmy.
All right. So yeah, I definitely say a lot of my interests lie within design, engineering, and entrepreneurship. There's no order there. I consider them all equal. I definitely think that with entrepreneurship, at least, there's not a lot of resources that I can tap into at my school to sort of further that. But I think that's fine because so much of what I've learned about entrepreneurship has come from my own smaller little ventures. Learning things that way on my own, I think, has taught me more than exploring that in academic context. Design and engineering, however, those are things that while I have certain projects that I want to do on my own, I need to find those skills. And I think those skills that I have in those spaces have come from school. I've taken classes to gain skills that I can then apply to things that I'm doing outside of school on my own time, my own interests. So I think school has definitely helped me in those two areas specifically.
Thanks, Kanoa. Tex?
Yeah, some of the things which I really enjoy are to do with coding and designing and doing things like that. And our school definitely has good resources with that. Our teacher who assists in teaching coding and computers, they've kind of said and accepted that for me and some of my other friends who all enjoy it as well, they've helped out as much as they can, but they still have limited knowledge. So it would be nice for the school to have a bit more teaching of the teachers in that, but they help out, they give us resources, and they assist as much as possible. So it's good.
Emmy?
I think my interest is really rooted in community organizing And I would love to learn more about movement theory and social change. I think my interests really sit at the intersection of art and activism. And we aren't taught that stuff in school particularly. I think that I grew up going to a Jewish school, a private school, when I was much littler. And there, I think these kinds of things were more nurtured. We did things like making sandwiches for the hungry. We kind of had this like social justice work baked in. But I think when we get into the public school system, as Chris was saying, there isn't really room for anything that isn't one size fits all at most, American public schools. And so we are definitely thinking about our work at the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team as another kind of learning collaborative and as another equally important, if not paramount, place and community of learners. And I think that point that Tex was making is really crucial, that students can teach teachers and teachers can teach students, and that teaching and learning is nonlinear. And so for us on the team, for example, with our latest project, we had researchers with PhDs who I think will tell you that they learned from us, and we will tell you that we learned an immense amount from them. And I think being able to work in that way as we really think about transforming systems and creating a more just world is where my interests lie. And I hope that one day schools, at least schools like mine, are able to nurture that. But I know that that takes a real shift in policies and practice that is not going to happen overnight.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question which I don't know how to ask. So I'm going to tell you, this is going to follow in all of your
Sign
answers.
language, use sign language.
It's like Chris's question. Because, when I travel, when I move, when I talk to a lot of students, there's one thing that's in common. People always say there's teachers teach too much. That is, in a class, they kept lecturing, they kept teach, but students can do a lot more on their own. There are also students complain about the curriculum. They're offering too many things, like maybe Amy, you were saying, that you may or may not be interested in, but you are offered that. So I was wondering, three of you can help answer these questions. Do you feel like your time sometimes have been wasted? Maybe not yours, maybe your friends' time have been wasted in schools because of the curriculum or because of the teaching? I'll start with the Kanoa.
Thank you. Yeah, so I personally feel like my time hasn't been wasted, but that's just because I've, once again, picked the classes that I'm interested in and picked the classes I thought were worthwhile. I do, however, think that there are other people who are wasting their time. They may not think that, but that's up to them. But I really do think that everyone who feels like they're doing something worthwhile, they're doing something that's not, that's worth their time. So in short, no.
So how do you develop the ability to not waste your time as a student? Since schools do waste people's time, how do you develop that ability? The reason you are here because you are different from others, I guess.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I'm not the person here talking about student voice, but I think obviously self-advocacy and making your education work for you, that's, and speaking up, because there have been times where I obviously felt like teachers were not doing what they should be doing, not doing things that were productive. And I think being able to voice that opinion is critical. And I think because I've been able to do that, I've been able to not have my time wasted.
Well, I like that. So you are the owner of your own education and advocating this for that part. I'll go to Tex and I'll go back to Amy. Tex, what do you think?
It can be sometimes,
Which time first? Go ahead.
when our school makes our class collaborate with some other classes, that can definitely feel like time's wasted just because it's not so much the teacher's fault, but they can't get their words out through some of the other classes which are a bit lower down, just interrupting. So it feels like our time's being wasted in putting classes together where there's one class which has people like me who want to learn and want to go to school, put it with other classes where there's people who are just enjoying being annoying and wasting time. So it's not so much the teachers as the curriculum putting us together, I'd say.
Well, so Tex, do you feel like you're going to school as yourself? Do you own your own learning? Are you actively engaged in selecting courses, doing things you want to do in school?
For the most part, yes, it is. It's been good. It's struggled with that at the start of the year because with COVID, we had to delay all of. It was meant to be term one is a bit of a trial to see out everything, and then you choose what you want. But because of COVID, they got pushed back to term three. So it's felt like there was term two had to just be another term of the trials when everyone kind of knew what we wanted and knew what we we're going to do. So that felt like it was harder to own your time then. But this term's definitely felt more like I could manage myself and do what I wanted to do.
Well, you have a long way to go. You're just only in 7th grade, so I know that's good. Emmy, I know your student voice is about voice your opinion. So what do you think of my question about do schools waste time in some ways of students?
I think absolutely I have felt that way, but I also think that largely comes with privilege and that being able to self-advocate is not equitably accessible to all. And that comes with a lot of support. So if me speaking up is going to come off very differently than a student who maybe isn't from my zip code or isn't doesn't look the way I do, doesn't have the parents with the same educational background as mine. There's a lot of layers there that I think sometimes get lost. And for sure, I have felt like school was wasting my time, but I think that one remedy I see and one opportunity I see, really a better way of describing it as an opportunity, is for schools and communities to connect more. I think that oftentimes for fear of being political, schools don't engage with the issues around them, and that feels really isolating, particularly to students who are experiencing those issues as an attack on their identity, as their being, as their way of life. And so if we can push back on this divorced nature of our schools and our society, I think there's a lot of room for schools not to waste our time, but to really shape our whole selves and create space and community for us to explore many different things that we need to explore. And I think I wouldn't want anyone to read this as saying that, teachers can't lecture, because there can be a lot of power in a lecture, but I think there has to be agency first. And thinking about even just, for example, how a student is sitting or standing, if they can move, if they can drink water during that time. There's a lot of, particularly in light of COVID-19, right, conversation around in class, do you have to keep your video on? What you have to wear. There are schools that are like, you can't wear PJs. And I think thinking about those freedoms and how that actually deeply influences how students are experiencing learning, whether it's the time of day that they're learning or who's teaching them. And if they see themselves reflected in that person or in the curriculum, that those kind of nuances really need to be at the forefront of our thinking.
Thank you so much, because I just finished a book called Teaching Students to Become Self-Determined Students. The right to self-determination is really important. You were talking about freedom, what areas. I actually believe teachers should lecture as less as possible. Actually, I think you can watch great lectures on YouTube and other places. You don't really have to lecture. I'm also talking about a lot about how students should really determine how they want to learn and what they want to learn and in what environment they want to learn. I don't think there's honestly a necessity for a teacher to lecture third students. I don't think that's necessary. But Chris, you have a question.
I've talked to a lot of adults who've been successful in their lives, and when you ask them about their education, they often talk about a teacher, or maybe if they're really lucky, two teachers who just kind of turned things around for them. Pre-college, in my case, it was my high school chemistry teacher. And I wonder if each of you has, as you look back, not as adults, but at least on your education so far, if there are any teacher or teachers who just stood out for you and somehow had a big influence on you, and why you think they had that influence. So, Tex, can I toss it to you?
Yeah, I'd say there has been a few teachers in particular who are just with our humanities. I'd say that's one of the classes where we have every day almost, and our home humanities teacher, she's very good at making students feel comfortable and encouraging learning and getting the point across if the class is misbehaving, reining them in, and just being a general good teacher while still making you feel comfortable and enjoy it.
Kanoa?
Sure. So Dr. Hines, he is the MPX coordinator. So he's the one who ran the MPX program during my freshman and sophomore year while I was in it, right? He never was a teacher of mine. So while he was the one who wrote the STEM curriculum for MPX, he was never my teacher. But despite that, I've had so many interactions with him, and not just sort of within school, right? He's also the outrigger canoe paddling coach. And, we've had so many conversations about who I'm going to be and what I could be in so many interesting places, right? That seems like a weird thing to talk about when you're in a 6-man canoe, halfway out to sea, but he's really had an impact on me, less so in school, but more so as who I am and who I sort of should be as a person for other people.
Hemi?
It's a challenging question for me too. I think that largely my teachers and mentors that I hold most close have not been in the school building, and I think one layer of this for me is that I actually didn't think of community organizing or politics or kind of however you categorize it as my thing growing up, and I think it was really through joining the Pritchard Committee Student Voice team and my mentors and collaborators there that showed me that this kind of work isn't about ownership. It's really about a larger sense of community and obligation. And so I think so many of my greatest teachers have been younger than me or the same age as me, and others have been more traditional mentors, like our adult director, Rachel. But I think that's another area where I would push back on kind of a singular conception of what that mentorship looks like, and think more broadly about the kinds of ways that we can teach each other and learn from each other.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I think Punya, you have another question.
Yeah, and if you've been following the chat, you sort of know where it's going. So Zauled put his cards on the table. For him, if he had to change one thing, it would be like driven by student autonomy. I'm not in disagreement with that. I think within the structure of schools that we have today, my pet peeve is the age fixed classrooms, you know, where you put students as if like everybody's lockstep, blah, 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 right? And so if there would be one thing I would change, I would mix up ages, because I think that's phenomenal for learning for everybody. You suddenly lose this one bar that everybody has to meet at exactly the same time, so on and so forth. So this is a question I've been asking my faculty here at Arizona State, sort of because COVID has sort of uprooted everything. What would be one thing that you completely would change if you could change school? What is one thing that you would say this needs to just completely go away? It's sort of a parallel, I think, to Zhao's question about, you know, the school wasting your time or whatever. So what is one aspect of school that if you could redesign school, you would say this should go away and be replaced by something else? Like, what is it that, you know, I can point back to my schooling to things that I would be like, okay, that should have changed, right? Just as an experience as a student. I'm just curious to see what you guys think. Anybody can jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Punya. So that's a little tough for me because I have a hard time thinking about this in a huge sort of broad fundamental way. It's really hard to think about it away from or apart from my personal experience. I think the one thing I've been pushing for is a transition to full IB, right? Because I am so limited in the number of being full diploma, I can only take 6 IB classes and I have to be taking IB classes. But because my school still has the majority of its students doing a standard curriculum, the number of IB classes and the variety that is offered to me is really limited, especially when I talk to some of my friends overseas back in my old school, and they're like, yeah, we have 3 different kinds of English. And I'm like, what? I have one. We only have one. That's it. And so I think that's something I would definitely change. But once again, that's something that is personal to me and not this big fundamental shift that some of you guys might want.
Bex, you want to tell us what would you change about school?
Yes, same with Kanoa, but it's hard to imagine one massive change in my power. But if I could, I'd probably want to make it so there's a bit more opportunity to do things online. I feel like COVID for our school, especially, it's shown that teachers and students have a potential to be able to use our laptops and go on Zoom and do this. And I feel like it'd be nice to have a change to where it would be, in some of our classes, it's still fully not allowed to use the laptops, just pen and paper. So it'd be nice for the shift to technology becoming one of the things which you can use in every class, an option, rather than hoping that the teacher says yes.
Me?
I think one thing I would change is, and in addition to that kind of sentiment I expressed earlier about the connectedness of schools and communities, a framework where we can really explore our interests at large and be seen as people. Unfortunately, because of attendance policies and even just the way we're confined in terms of how we can sit, when we can eat, what we can do, all of these little things build up to a really transactional relationship with each other when we're in the school building or in online formats today. And I think that one phrase that we've been coming back to throughout our Coping with COVID-19 study is this idea, in addition to students as partners, of students as people. And it's crazy that we have to say that, but we do. And I would really love to see a school system that saw students as their full selves and valued us with all our humanity.
You know, I know Chris has a question. So all of you, I might come back to, because I'm actually finished writing a book called Learners Without Borders. So the idea is really goes back to Punya's question, because you guys are really coming from schools or because of yourself have done amazing things. You're already quite different. I know Tex, your school is not common in Australia. Neither does Kanoa school. You know, I don't know about Amy, your school. I've not studied your school. But I think the important thing is that the school system by and large are not necessarily represented by the schools you have experienced. So that's quite, I think that's what comes to Emmanuel and Amy, your suggestion to say, yes, you want to have student advocacy, but individuals sometimes cannot advocate for what they have. If you are in a bad school, in a poor area, in a school not responsive, that's really a big challenge. I think we're inviting you here to hear your voices because we have a bias as well. We've selected you, so our show has a certain bias as well. Now I'll go back to Chris. What's your question?
Well, all of us are here also because we're all in the area of technology. And we believe that technology is powerful for learning and either underused in education or sometimes used in ways that automate old systems rather than innovating new systems. But I want to step away from school and just say, is there some technology in your life that you just really like using for learning? And what is it, and why do you like it? When you're not in school, when you're just, and it doesn't have to be academic learning, when you just want to learn something, what do you do, and how does it work for you?
I'll start by saying our team and a number of other youth organizations use Slack, and I think it's an amazing platform where we can really engage and kind of enact our values of being non-hierarchical and push back on kind of just habitually the way systems tend to operate. Sometimes we're working at 1 a.m. and sometimes, we're working on simultaneously. Sometimes I'm responding to something that's been sent hours prior. We're utilizing emojis. We're like, as a real valid full response, we're thinking about, we could send like paragraphs and paragraphs in a really academic sense, and we could also send, shorthand and slang, and it would all be considered valid. And I think that just creating that kind of space is a really like powerful microcosm of what we're trying to do more broadly.
Yeah, my teaching team and I use Slack as our communications medium, so I certainly would agree with what you're saying. Tex?
I'd say with learning, there's definitely been, like I said before, I really want to learn how to code better and get better at coding. So there's a lot of websites that, like Code Academy, those sort of websites that are very useful. And also through the school package, you can download Adobe Creative Cloud for free. And I've been using that to also do some video editing, because that's something we've been doing a bit more in school. So I'd say that definitely those two have been very useful to learn outside of just the generic academic maths or English.
Tonya would agree with you about video editing for sure. No?
Yeah, so I think my answer is a little less interesting. But, I tend to read a lot of books. A lot of it does tend to be fiction. But I still feel like there's something to be gleaned from reading a really solid book. And I read a lot of stuff on my Kindle. And I think e-readers sort of had an explosion and then they sort of went, but I think where they are now, I really, really get so much use in terms of just hours per day out of my Kindle. And I think it's a fantastic piece of hardware.
So I have a really bunch of questions. I want to ask you, given what Kano was saying, that really two big questions. Why is that it's maybe out of your way? I've been advocating for students to become unique and great in their own way. That is, you develop your own passion, you have your own strength. Therefore, not all the courses are necessary for all people. Okay, so that's my argument. So that's now, but I want to come down back to you to say, okay, if you look at not your school necessarily, but schools around you, your friends around you, do you feel like students by and large are rising up to take that lead, to say, I want, this is my school, my experience, I want to lead, I want to drive my own learning? How often do you see that? Tex, Do you see people, students like others, try to be the leader of their own learning text?
Yeah, we see that sometimes in my class. We get people like that, but obviously because we're just year sevens, I can't imagine there'd be anywhere near as many as you two would have. But yeah, there's definitely is a push towards, especially like me and my friends who we value our learning a lot, and we've pushed sometimes for our class to be able to be put away from the other classes and actually work by ourselves. So it's definitely there, but I wouldn't imagine it to be as common as it would be for you two.
Do you have any advice for those people? You want how do they pay attention to their own learning, be the owners of their own learning? What advice would you have?
But any advice, it would just be to realize that for classes where there's students who want to learn, let them learn. Like if they need help, or if you're teaching something new which they wouldn't know, then that's when you go to the lectures or go to the explaining. But if it's something where students are learning by watching it and learning by doing it themselves, if you know that the class is wanting to learn, then just let them learn. Don't be there and don't stop them every 5 minutes.
So I have another question for you before I move on to the next one. What do you think of the idea students can offer courses to their peers in your school?
I definitely agree with that. Like one of my friends, he's very good with video editing, and he's been teaching me how to use it. And it's, if you want to learn, then get in, and there's valuable information. In my opinion, it doesn't matter if it's coming from a teacher, a student, a parent, whatever, then take the information.
Thank you. I like that, because I would like to have all students have a chance to offer courses to teach other students through which they can learn. Kanua, let me come to you to the same question.
Yeah, sure. So I feel like most students don't take ownership for their own learning. And I don't think this is because they don't want to. I think it's mostly because, first of all, they don't know they can. They don't know that's something they can actually do. And second, obviously, I think this is something Emmanuel's talked about a lot. They don't have the resources to do that. They don't have the ability to actually take ownership of and sort of drive their own curriculum and their education and how that will go. And yeah, I mean,
would you support the idea of getting students to teach, have a committee, like everyone can nominate, I can teach this, what do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. I think Tex was spot on. It doesn't matter who it's coming from if they have the skills. And I think, obviously, I don't want to say that teaching is not a skill. Teaching is absolutely a skill. And I know that me and a lot of students I know can't teach. I think that's something you have to develop. But saying that students can't develop that is totally wrong. It's just something we have to learn. And I think we can, and I think we should.
Well, I know one thing,
if I can just add one thing, Zhao, with your question, I'm just reminded of when I was in high school, one teacher sort of volunteered me to teach something, a certain topic. And I must have studied that the hardest that I've ever studied anything. I remember it was special relativity, in a physics class. And my understanding of the physics of that is foundationally because I spent a heck of a amount of time trying to understand how do I explain it to others in a way that, so I not only have to think I know it, I have to know it well enough to get it to somebody else. And I think that's sort of an added component to what Kanua you said, which is that yes, teaching is an art, but that ability to now put yourself in the other person's shoes to see how would they receive that information, that's an amazing skill. That communication and being able to integrate information, that's incredibly important wherever you are in life. It doesn't matter. So I think there's an added benefit to it.
Puna, you just highlighted what we call social constructivism, right? When children tutor each other, they learn a lot more. That's the point. If you want to learn something, teach it. I always say that. So if you want to go learn something deep, teach somebody what you want to learn. Emmy?
Absolutely. Yeah. And as I was saying, I think on our team, I've learned from people who are younger than me, older than me, the same age as me. And we learn by doing as well. As you were saying, I agree with Kanoa that it's a skill to teach and that it's something we master, but I also think it's something that a lot of us can learn by doing. And as we really push back on hierarchies that operate in other spaces, I think we make it more and more easy for everyone to be a teacher. And really broadening that creates a lot of power when we're talking about how we push back on systems. If you know, not only 5 people in the group, but the whole group feel empowered to do that and feel supported to do that, we're really operating with a different trajectory than we would be otherwise.
You know, I want to thank you. I have one final request for all the 3 of you, because you came to this show and help us heighten this. Everybody loves you on the YouTube live chat. Everybody wants to hire you. You want to be leaders. They have a lot of questions, but actually I have one request for all of you. Can you give us one suggestion to schools and teachers? What would that be? In one suggestion, again, going back, it's almost like Punya's request, more of us, but Rain, or maybe to other students, what would you recommend? Anything that you can leave this show, because people do watch this, they want to see, what would it be, you know, to survive the COVID-19, to be better human beings, or to live in a post-COVID situation? What would it be? One thing. Amy, I will start with you.
I think we can really build community when we see the humanity in everyone, and when our kind of daily practices reflect that reality. And so I think what I would say is that teachers and students should tap into the power of community organizing, whether that's independent of their schools or within their school, and really support this critical moment in standing against racial injustice and standing for a world in which we can all learn and all teach.
Thank you. Community organizations, that's powerful. Kanoa, I'm coming to you.
Yeah, so I think my big word of advice is, you know, use first names. I feel like the best teachers or the best connections I've had is when teachers sort of break down that gap between us, where it's like we are no longer teacher and student, we're just 2 people talking to each other. And I think that's just a huge part of, you know, valuing students as people, and then their work starts to have value. And I think that whole, I think an easy way to do that is just start using first names.
That's very powerful. So I think when Amy talk about community organizations, you're talking about teacher student as human beings, the humanity of education. You build a relationship with that text.
Yeah, I agree with what Kanoa said. Just really don't be, if you're a teacher, don't be the shouty, angry, because that doesn't work. That just makes the students that are more rebellious rebel, and others that want to teach, they might shrink back and not volunteer as much information or do as much as you hope. So just don't, obviously keep some boundaries still there. Make sure they still know that they can't just say whatever they want, but make the students feel comfortable and make them know that you enjoy teaching them, so they feel appreciated. Don't make them worry about going to class.
You know, thank you, Tex. You guys are truly amazing. Would love to talk with you more, you know, and you are so inspirational and insightful. I'm happy that we are all going to retire better because of you. You know, I always say schools do not prepare children for their future. We prepare you to create the future. You're the creators of our future. I love talking to young people because, again, I said, that's my retirement. Now, seeing you here makes me feel good. We are going to have good retirement. So thank you very much.
At least better than what we are leaving to them.
Oh,
You
well, we're
know.
not responsible for their future. Well, okay, so you will be creating your future. So I want to say, okay, thank you so much, the three of you. You guys were wonderful. We'll send you the link. And now I want to bring Kurt back to announce our next episode. Kurt?
Sure. We're going to have a good friend of mine who's got chapters in 3 of my books, friend from the World Bank, the head of the Open Learning Campus. Her name is Sheila Jaganathan, originally. So Punya might want to come in and ask her a lot of questions too. Her range of interests is quite wide, whether it's AI or big data or virtual worlds or hybrid learning or talent management or massive open online classes. The list goes on, and she's been to a wide range of places in the Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, North Africa, all over the world with the World Bank. So she's got a new book. Chris Dady has a chapter in it. She's working on sustainability, and she'll talk about that as well. So I look forward to hosting that with Chris and one other person yet to be decided. And we'll see you all next time at the normal time, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I apologize for last week when I forgot to mention it. So thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank